The Toronto Blue Jays are about to make a decision that says a lot more about this roster than just one injured player returning. Because when Addison Barger comes back, somebody has to go. And honestly, there may not be a clean answer. Barger is expected to return from the injured list sometime within the next few days, possibly as early as Wednesday. The Blue Jays have desperately needed another impact bat in this lineup. And even though Barger struggled before the injury, this organization still views him as one of the more important offensive pieces on the roster. Why? Because we already saw what he can become. Last season, Barger proved he could hit major league pitching consistently over a full year. Then in the postseason, when the pressure intensified and the spotlight got brighter, he elevated his game even further. That matters inside a clubhouse. It matters to a coaching staff. And it absolutely matters to a front office trying to compete in an increasingly difficult American League. So there's no debate about whether he'll play. He will. The real debate is who loses their roster spot because of it. And when you break down the current construction of the Blue Jays roster, the answer becomes surprisingly complicated. See, before the injury, Barger was splitting time between third base and right field. But things have changed since he's been out. Kazuma Okamoto has settled in nicely at third base, giving Toronto stability at the hot corner both offensively and defensively. That changes the equation entirely. Now, instead of bouncing between positions, Barger is expected to spend most of his time in the outfield. He'll probably rotate into designated hitter occasionally too, especially on days when the Blue Jays want to rest George Springer. But regardless of how they deploy him, one thing is obvious. An outfielder is probably getting squeezed off this roster. And when you look at the names involved, 3 candidates stand out immediately. Yohendrick Piñango, Davis Schneider, and potentially Lenyn Sosa. But not all roster decisions are created equally. Because technically, Sosa presents the biggest risk. Unlike Piñango and Schneider, he's out of minor league options. That means if Toronto wants to remove him from the active roster, they can't simply send him to AAA. They would have to designate him for assignment. And that's significant. DFA decisions aren't minor administrative moves. They expose players to waivers. Other teams get opportunities. Depth can disappear instantly, especially with a player who still has some upside and defensive versatility. So while Sosa is technically a possibility, the Blue Jays may hesitate before making that move. That leaves the spotlight squarely on Piñango and Schneider. And here's where things get interesting. Because if you asked this question a week ago, the answer probably would have been obvious. Piñango would have gone down. Simple, clean, expected. When Toronto originally called him up, it felt temporary from the start. A short-term replacement, a depth piece, someone who could hold a spot until Barger returned. But baseball doesn't always follow the original script. Since arriving in the majors, Piñango has done exactly what struggling teams fear from temporary replacements. He's forced the organization to rethink the plan. Monday night against the Tampa Bay Rays may have changed the conversation entirely. Batting leadoff for the second straight game, Piñango collected 3 hits in a 5-1 loss. And honestly, the stat line only tells part of the story. What stood out more was how composed he looked. The approach, the confidence, the timing. He wasn't flailing at pitches. He wasn't overwhelmed by major league velocity. He looked calm, selective, and under control. For a young hitter making his first impression at this level, that matters. Then he followed it up with another hit the next day. Suddenly, this isn't just a prospect surviving. This is a player producing. And for a Blue Jays team starving for offense, that changes everything. Because Toronto's biggest issue this season hasn't been pitching. It's been inconsistency at the plate. Too many quiet innings. Too many runners stranded. Too many stretches where the lineup simply disappears. That's why Barger's return matters so much in the first place. The Blue Jays need impact bats. They need energy. They need production, which makes the Piñango conversation incredibly difficult. How do you send down one of the few hitters actually contributing, especially when the alternative hasn't exactly earned security either? Because while Davis Schneider finally had a breakthrough moment over the weekend, the overall numbers remain rough. Very rough. His two-run double against Minnesota snapped a brutal offensive drought, but entering this stretch, Schneider had been buried in one of the coldest starts on the roster. A .137 batting average, a .323 on-base percentage, a .255 slugging percentage. And those numbers perfectly capture the strange reality of Schneider's season. Because in some ways, he's still helping. He's taking walks. He's showing plate discipline. He's grinding through at-bats. But there's a fine line between patience and passivity. And right now, Schneider may be leaning too far toward passive. Pitchers aren't fearing him. They're attacking him. And too often, at-bats are ending without hard contact. Now, to Schneider's credit, this isn't entirely new territory. Blue Jays fans have already seen him go through ups and downs before. Last year was inconsistent too. There were stretches where he looked like a breakout piece and stretches where he looked overmatched. The organization still believes there's a productive hitter in there. And honestly, they may be right. But contenders don't always have time to wait for potential. That's the problem. The Blue Jays entered this season expecting to compete immediately. Expectations weren't about development. They were about winning. And when a team struggles offensively, urgency changes roster decisions. Managers stop prioritizing patience. Front offices stop prioritizing projections. Results become everything. Right now, Piñango is giving them results. Schneider isn't, at least not consistently. But this decision isn't entirely about numbers. There's also the question of roster balance. And this is where Schneider still has a real argument in his favor. Handedness matters. Barger hits left-handed. Piñango hits left-handed. That creates overlap. Schneider, meanwhile, bats right-handed, which gives Toronto another option against left-handed pitching. Over a long season, those platoon advantages can matter significantly. Managers value flexibility. Bench construction matters. And from a pure roster-building standpoint, Schneider makes more sense as a complementary piece. But here's the counterargument. What if Piñango is simply better right now? Because while theoretical matchups are important, actual production matters more. And so far, Piñango hasn't shown obvious weaknesses against left-handed pitching anyway. Small sample size? Sure. But the early signs are encouraging enough to make the Blue Jays think twice. At some point, teams have to reward performance. Otherwise, what message are you sending the clubhouse? That production doesn't matter? That hot streaks don't matter? That roster decisions are predetermined regardless of who's actually helping you win? Those are dangerous dynamics for competitive teams, especially teams already fighting pressure early in the season. And make no mistake, pressure is building in Toronto. This roster was built to contend, not hover around mediocrity, not struggle offensively for weeks at a time, not spend every series searching for answers at the plate. The Blue Jays believed they had enough talent to compete with the elite teams in the American League. But through the opening stretch of the season, consistency has been elusive. That's why every roster move suddenly feels larger. Every lineup adjustment feels magnified. Every decision becomes part of a bigger conversation about the direction of the season. And that's exactly why the Barger situation matters so much. Because this isn't only about one player returning from injury. It's about organizational priorities. Do the Blue Jays trust upside? Do they trust experience? Do they prioritize roster balance? Or do they simply reward whoever is producing right now? There's no perfect answer. If they send down Piñango, they risk cooling off one of the few hitters bringing energy to the lineup. If they send down Schneider, they lose a player they still believe can contribute long-term while also sacrificing some right-handed balance. If they DFA Sosa, they risk losing depth entirely. Every path carries consequences. And honestly, that's what makes this fascinating. Because the easy answer isn't always the correct one. Baseball front offices constantly talk about process over results. But eventually, results start forcing new processes. Piñango may be doing exactly that. A week ago, this conversation barely existed. Now, he may have played himself into staying. And if that happens, it says something important about where the Blue Jays are mentally right now. They need offense immediately. Not eventually. Immediately. Of course, whichever player loses their spot probably hasn't played their final game in Toronto this season. That's the reality of modern baseball. Injuries happen constantly. Slumps happen constantly. Bullpen moves reshape benches every week. The roster never stays frozen for long. So even if Piñango goes down, he'll likely return at some point this summer. If Schneider gets optioned, chances are he'll get another opportunity too. And even Sosa could find his way back, depending on how the season unfolds. But in the short term, this move still matters, because it reveals what the Blue Jays value most at this moment in time. Potential, flexibility, experience, or immediate production. We're about to find out. And honestly, whichever decision they make will tell us a lot about how desperate this organization believes the current situation really is.